Hello, everyone. Today I'll be presenting grounded theory research design, and I'll be walking you through the definitions, the features, some variations, procedures, critiques, some ethical issues, and some examples of the grounded theory. And I'll also share discussion questions for us to reflect on towards the end. So by the end of today's presentation, you should be able to identify the major research concepts, the logic, and the features of grounded theory. You should also be able to recognize when and why grounded theory is appropriate to the design choice. You should be able to describe its procedures and methods of data analysis and explain ethical issues unique to the grounded research theory. And then I want you to also be able to critically evaluate some studies, and these outcomes really align with the course objectives and identifying research design methods and their applications. So, grounded theory is a qualitative design developed by Glasser and Strauss in 1967 to generate theory inductively from data rather than test existing theories. It's best used when there's no adequate theory that exists or when researchers really want to explain processes or actions or interactions. For example, if we want to understand how preschool teachers adapt classroom routines during their first year, grounded theory would help enable us develop a model based on teachers' lived experiences rather than focusing on or forcing their experiences into existing frameworks that may not exactly fit. So, some key features of grounded theory include emergent design, which is a theory that arises from data not imposed beforehand. Systematic coding, so open, axial, and selective coding. Consistent comparison of new data or continually compared to existing codes. Theoretical sampling, which chooses participants based on how they can expand or refine emerging categories, and it focuses on the process. So, grounded theory really explains how things happen, not just what happens. Grounded theory has evolved into several traditions. So, you have classic grounded theory that emphasizes emergence and minimizing researcher bias. You have Straussian grounded theory, which is more structured with coding steps and axial coding. Constructivist grounded theory, which emphasizes co construction of meaning between the researcher and the participants. Situational analysis uses mapping and broader social discourse, and each variation reflects differently but shares the core logic of inductively generating theory. Now, the grounded theory process is iterative and it goes in cycles. So, we're going to identify a general problem area, and that's going to lead us to start collecting initial data, often through interviews or observations. And then we're going to begin coding immediately. And now, this open coding, it breaks down data into concepts, or you could do axial coding, which is linking categories together, or you could do selective coding, which is refining a central or core category. You can do all of these kind of in this section. You want it to start with that breaking it into those bigger categories, and then it just kind of refines it and pares it down. So the use of this constant comparison helps refine these categories to help ensure that we are getting the most from the data that's being collected. And when we engage in theoretical sampling, we gather more data to saturate categories. So we develop a substantial theory explaining the study process. And as Corbin and Strauss note, the theory should both be explanatory and grounded in participants' perspectives. So you'll also see that you'll have theoretical sampling, and then you'll go back and you'll collect more data that really helps lead and substantiate this theory that you're trying to create. Now, when we analyze the data, we need to somehow deconstruct it so we can reassemble it into actionable information or findings. And we do this by evaluating our data and organizing it into our findings, into concepts and categories. So the concepts are really your low-level codes, or put simply, the first layer of data that you highlight and tag that is important. And once you ask that kind of question, you could also go to a mentor and say, maybe, what should I code? And it could be something they could really think about these categories maybe a little bit more defined to help you. And then it's pretty simple that anything you find interesting or meaningful, you really want to tag it. And that is the concepts in grounded theory. Now, your categories are clustered into concepts that have similar ideas and can come from several different data sources. Typically, these are written in the form of insights or themes that you see in your experience. And then a key method is that's used in grounded theory is called the constant comparative method, which means that any findings like the categories, the concepts, the theories are constantly compared against each other to make sure that the new data emerges to further refine the interpretations and the theories. So it's this, once again, this cycle that you're going to go through to kind of make sure that you're really um, embedding all the data that you can that you've taken to help substantiate your categories, which ends up being your theory when you get towards the end of these cycles. Now, data analysis in grounded theory includes coding, so that's systematic labeling of text. And you can use this as something that you do by hand, or you could use a software that can assist you with the coding. Memo writing are like those analytic notes that you capture insights during the research process. So you may notice certain things that you want to remember as you're watching and doing your observations, or as you're reading through, that you really want to make maybe one of those categories or concepts as you go through and think about your data. You're also going to think about visual diagrams, so mapping categories in their relationships. So this could look like anything from those bubble maps that we've done in class before, or it could even be as elaborate as a diagram or a model that you see these things have correlation between them. Now, the iterative nature of the analysis means that the data collection and analysis happens simultaneously. So these things are constantly going back and forth to make sure that you can refine these things to be able to best suit the theory that you're trying to support. Now, the process of data collection and analysis in grounded theory is quite flexible, and it can be done simultaneously, like I said. This back and forth is called the zigzag approach to collection and analysis, and where the researcher is continuously refining their concepts and categories on the subject until there are diminishing returns on theoretical saturation, or when new data comes in and doesn't lead to refinement of thinking or new ideas. And when you revisit the data, it can look like this table here, where you take your collection of methods through theoretical sampling. And then the process of analysis is essential to look back and really course correct. You start thinking about questions like, well, how are things going? Are we learning anything new? Are we surprised by the new data that's coming in? Or are we receiving similar answers to what we had before? Are the categories that we already have and concepts, are they supported well? Or do we need to rethink what we have in those concepts and categories to maybe make this a little bit more substantiated? So in grounded theory, Glaser and Strauss call this process theoretical sampling, and it's a way for researchers to identify a category that may need further research and inquiry. And so what they had said in 1967 was the process of data collection for generating theory, whereby the analyst jointly collects, codes, and analyzes his data, decides what data to collect next and where to find them. So it really informs what you're going to be doing, if it's how you're going to get a source of data when you really start thinking about it. So as you review your concepts and categories over time, your existing research should direct or redirect you as where to go next and what data to collect. But the question that normally comes up is, well, how do I know when to stop collecting data? And Strauss called this the moment of theoretical saturation. And so that just means the point in the category development where no new properties or dimensions or relationships emerge through this analysis. So the concepts and the categories are theoretically saturated and no new ideas are emerging from the data. And that's when you know that you've gotten to the point where you've done all you can do and it's time to move forward. And when you move forward, you really start thinking about this theory building. So you've already been through level 1, level 2, and then you're going to start really thinking about that level 3 in real time about how important it is. And so in order to identify that a theory has emerged from it, you need to have a deep and nuanced understanding of it. And so Glaser and Strauss called this theoretical sensitivity. And so theoretical sensitivity simply means that through the ongoing process of data collection, analysis, and even more collection, researchers become more familiar with the data and are able to unearth insights and evaluate relationships between two concepts and categories that lead to relevant theories or insights. And in grounded theory, most of these theories come from identified categories, which are also referred to as core categories. And so in writing these, some people have had this experience where it's not as actionable for our needs as the user experience space. And so they found that writing their learnings as one of the following could be helpful. So either write them as insight statements. So I noticed, and you move forward that way. A problem statement, I couldn't find, or there was no evidence of, could be a problem statement, and then a job to be done statement. And so when you start looking at those, it really helps tell what your next step is going to be in this theory building. So lastly, and most importantly, in order to identify a theory that's emerged from the data, you have to have this understanding. And so we've already talked about that a little bit with the sensitivity. So as you become more and more familiar with the data, you're going to be able to unearth those insights and evaluate those relationships at an even deeper level. And it's going to help you see how these categories lead to relevant insights or theory. And so, as you can see here, it really shows how this fluctuates and it ebbs and flows in this diagram to really lead to that grounded theory. Now, ethical issues in the grounded theory include making sure that you've gotten informed consent. So participants have to know that the study direction may evolve. So that's something that you have to put in your informed consent. They have to know that this can change and it can lead to different directions. Also, confidentiality. You need to protect participants' identities when categories may be cut across groups. So you have to ensure that their maybe demographics are not as prevalent in that reporting. And then you have to also make sure about researcher bias. So you have to ensure categories emerge from the data and not what your preconceived notion may be. And then dissemination, you need to make sure that being careful of the theory developed, it doesn't distort participants' lived realities. So we're honoring their voices in this theory building, that we're truly talking about what came from the data and not necessarily what we wanted to see in the data. Some critiques of grounded theory include that it can be extremely time intensive. So it takes a very long time to make sure that you've done this and done it well. And some argue that categories are often forced into data rather than emerging naturally. And so tensions exist between traditions. So just like we said at the beginning, there's all these different ways that grounded theories come out by these different people. And so some people say that Glaser is too structured, or the rigidness of the coding is not going to be helpful. So there's tension between these traditions. So you just have to really ensure that you've identified which direction you're going before you take on grounded theory. And the concept of saturation is contested. So how do we really know when there's no more data that's emerging? These are just some questions that you really have to address when you're sending your information out and you're developing this grounded theory, because despite these critiques, It remains one of the most widely used qualitative methodologies because they know if they back their claims with these evidences, then there's going to be enough there to actually have this grounded theory to stand on. Now, I reviewed two examples that this one is a dissertation, and it's called A Grounded Theory Study, Barriers of Expectations of Elementary Teachers Who Teach Students with Autism. And this was a PhD dissertation from the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And so the purpose in this dissertation was to understand from the educator's perspective what were the barriers and expectations in general and special education elementary teachers have when teaching students with autism. And so their method was a grounded theory approach, and the data came from teacher participants. And in the study, they developed an introductory model for supporting teachers who instructed to teach students with autism. And so why this was a good example was it had a very clear focus on the process of how teachers perceive barriers and expectations rather than just the description. It was very transparent in its theory building. It includes an emergent model and also listed some rich qualitative data with participants directly telling their experiences, what was a good fit with grounded theory, and then the potential limitations might have been the limited number of participants or the context. So it was just elementary teachers in specific settings. So being able to generalize this is limited, and so that's okay for grounded theory as long as the theory is grounded. Now I reviewed this one is kind of some of the thematic maps that they showed. I thought it was really important to show you how they broke down all of their categories within how they supported their theory. So as you can see here, they started out with these, maybe the teacher attitude, the parent, the administration, and that was who they really wanted to focus on. And then they also had one with the students with autism. So we started seeing how it emerged from there and really supported their theory as they went through. This next example is a peer-reviewed article, and it was a grounded theory-based qualitative approach for examining local implementation of public health policies during crises. It was a French case study that was done in 2023. And so it was to investigate how the national recommendations were implemented locally during the COVID-19 crisis in France. And it focused on the stakeholder coordination and adaptations of policy in a crisis context. And now they use grounded theory in their qualitative design, and this study used interviews and document analysis, and they collected data from multiple stakeholders, and they coded it with open coding and structural coding to identify the emergent themes. And they identified 3 levels of implementation, which was administration, organizational, and operational, and the various coordination modes among stakeholders, and revealed how crisis conditions forced adaptation of expected processes. And why this was a good match for an example was because between the research question and the grounded theory strengths, it explored evolving and emergent processes in a dynamic setting. And so it helps contribute to the theory by clarifying how policy implementation really works in crisis settings and not just in normal conditions. And they had a large amount of data that they used. So using both documents and interviews and multiple stakeholders accounts, it improved the depth and credibility of this study. Now, the limitation was due to the crisis context. Some standard procedures like stable settings, repeated member checks may be more challenging to implement. And some stakeholders have limited availability or recall dynamics in crisis settings that might affect what people were willing to share. So both of these really showed how grounded theory can be applied to the study and the complex processes that build new theory. So as you can see here, this is kind of how they did their coding diagrams, where they started. They noticed their emerging coding categories from their readings. And so as you can see, they specified what the content was, what the categories were that they were working with. Then they moved on to really coding that down between the administration, the organizations, like in the relationships, and then the management levels. So they really had to break it down and think about each part and section that was impacted in their review. Now, these examples are really useful because they demonstrate alignment with grounded theory and logic, and they show transparency in coding and analysis, and they contribute to the theory building in their respective fields. So it really shows the application and then how they did it, and then really highlights the ethical considerations that were there while they were building out this grounded theory. Now, a grounded theory research question might begin really broadly, and an example would be how do first year preschool teachers construct their professional identity? And from analysis, a model might emerge showing stages of identity negotiation, and later we could refine this into a testable hypothesis for mixed methods or quantitative research. And this shows how grounded theory contributes to the cycle of scientific inquiry. And so I really want you to think about, as we start discussing this over the week, what types of research questions are most suitable for grounded theory? Maybe how do you balance openness with some structure in grounded theory? What challenges do you anticipate in reaching saturation? If you were to take on a grounded theory, what would be some clues that would help you find that you've reached saturation? And then how do ethics shift when the direction of the study evolves midstream? How would you notify your participants? What would that look like? Be sure to choose one or more of these to discuss in our time together this week. Be sure to check the discussion board often to engage fully in the discussion so that we can ensure that we are getting everything we can about grounded theory in this course. So thank you so much for your kind attention. I hope to see you participating in the discussion soon.